Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm your host, Kerry Simmons, and welcome to Everyday Eerie, the podcast where the ordinary meets the extraordinary. Dive into the world of ghost stories, haunted objects, eerie places, and unsolved mysteries that will send shivers down your spine. Each week, we explore the tales that blur the line between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. So turn down the lights, settle in, and prepare to be spooked. So, on today's episode, we will be talking about two cases of demonic possession. One is interesting in that it was written about in the New Oxford Review by a psychiatrist, actually. And the other is interesting because it sort of blurs the line between the paranormal and the true crime genre. So, let's go ahead and dive right in. Our first story is about a woman who was given the pseudonym Julia, and that's how we're going to refer to her today. The story was written by a man named Richard E. Gallagher, who is a board-certified psychiatrist practicing in New York, or at least he was at the time of this article, and who is the only American psychiatrist to have been considered a consistent U.S. delegate to the International Association of Exorcists. So all this information, by the way, can be found in the article itself in the New Oxford Review. Now, it was Dr. Gallagher's belief that true demonic possessions were very rare, though definitely not impossible, and that oftentimes people who were suffering from psychosis were exploited as being possessed when they demonstrated these kinds of signs that would kind of, waver back and forth and make one think, okay, is this a psychosis, like a schizophrenia, or is this true demonic possession? He felt that possession was not the only form of demonic attack that could occur, also mentioning oppression or what he referred to as infestation, stating that these situations are less rare but still uncommon. Now, all this to say that in his retelling of Julia's story, he was sure that it met the criteria for true demonic possession, which has a fairly strict checklist to be considered as such, which I think we touched on in a couple of the other episodes on demonic possession, just running through what is actually required to determine that someone is truly possessed and requires an exorcism. So Julia, at this time, she's a middle-aged woman from the U.S. who sought help from the church herself, actually, because she was fairly convinced that she was being attacked by Satan or another demon. Now, Julia had been raised as a Catholic, but she was no longer practicing Catholicism. But because of what she knew from growing up, she felt that the church would be the best place for her to start, particularly the Catholic Church, because they are more known for participating in exorcisms. Now, she was referred to a more official priest exorcist who also assisted in the writing of this article and thus began her evaluation, which, like I stated above, includes a pretty strict list of tests to rule in or out true possession versus mental illness. Now, this is when she met Dr. Gallagher, who performed a psychiatric evaluation on her. And during this evaluation, Julia detailed a very long history of satanic worship and involvement with the occult. And this was obviously a red flag, but is certainly not the only criteria by which they would use to deem her truly possessed. While examining her with a variety of psychiatric tests, it was found that Julia was, quote, in no way psychotic. In fact, she was consistently logical, highly intelligent, and even quite engaging at times despite her obvious turmoil, end quote. Throughout the course of this evaluation, Julia would go into these trance-like states, which were said to be different from those with mental illness who will dissociate. As while she was in them, she would begin to threaten those around her, pull apart people's weaknesses, use foul language and vulgarity, often say phrases like, quote, leave her alone, you idiot, she's ours, end quote. These voices would be extremely different from Julia's regular voice, with some of them being extremely high-pitched, and other times the voice would be very, very low and guttural with a sort of masculine quality to it. She would also demonstrate a significant fear of anything religious or any sacred relics while she was in these trances. And when these trances were over, she would have absolutely no memory of them. Still, at this point, it would be logical for any, psychiatrist who means well to continue down the path of diagnosing more like a dissociated identity disorder, but this was quickly ruled out when she began to display other strange phenomena. A group was assembled to deal with this case at this point, as it was becoming a bit more complicated, complex, and involved. And this team included several certified and highly qualified mental health professionals, 4 Catholic priests, a deacon and his wife, 2 nuns who were nurses, one of which was a psychiatric nurse, and a few other volunteers. Which why you'd want to volunteer, nobody knows, but there were other volunteers. Now, obviously, when working on a case where many people are involved, there were quite a few instances where phone calls would be made back and forth between team members to discuss next steps and to make some plans. Julia would have no idea of these phone calls. These phone calls would happen in private, in people's homes, at their office space, so not in front of or around Julia. So she would have no knowledge of these phone calls, but when team members would be on the phone, they would be suddenly interrupted by one of Julia's voices from her trance-like states, interrupting these conversations over the phone line with phrases again like, "Leave her alone, you idiots. She's ours. Get away from her." And each member of the team would be witness to hearing this. So it's pretty impossible for her to be able to just infiltrate the phone line on a phone call that she absolutely has nothing about. And I mean, how would she have done that? So all of the team members experienced this, and this was just one other piece of convincing evidence for them. Now, Julia would also demonstrate what she referred to as psychic abilities, and these abilities were present without her even being in a trance-like state. So these were things that she had developed supposedly during her time as a Satan worshiper. Now, just her being in an area was enough to cause random paranormal activity to begin to unfold, like objects being around her flying off the shelves, and she seemed to have knowledge of the lives of the team members, which included intimate details and sensitive information about them that she would never be able to know. She had information about relatives of team members, family deaths and illnesses, personality traits of family members, and manners in which they may have passed, like specifying exact illnesses that they had. She knew of random, quote, sins of the team members and exploited this during discussions, and especially when she was in her trance-like states. In one instance, she mentioned to a team member, quote, "So those cats really went berserk last night, didn't they?" The morning after, one of the team members, 2 cats mysteriously and randomly began to attack each other at 2 a.m. The strangest part was that this team member did not even live in the same city, and it's like whatever was attached to Julia caused this fight to occur between the cats, just to stir up trouble amongst the team members' lives. She'd be able to confirm how people in the room were feeling and what team members were wearing, how many people were there when she wasn't even looking, when she was blindfolded, and where they were when they weren't even present. She would even be able to pick up on the emotions these people had when they were out doing something completely unrelated. So, for example, so-and-so was walking the beach and felt sad and was able to give details on this when she could not have known. And it's the cat story is interesting because you hear about that a lot with people who are, involved in the exorcism and how they begin to get attacked and they begin to experience things because these demons are trying to scare off or prevent the person who can help from being able to do just that. Now, after all of this, it was agreed upon that Julia would need a real exorcism as she was truly possessed, and this required Julia's permission. So on a warm and sunny day in June, she gave her permission. It was in the middle of summertime, so warm outside, right? Hot. The exorcism began, and the room that they were in grew really icy cold to where they could see their breath. Then later, during the actual exorcism, the room became extraordinarily hot, like an oven, causing team members to sweat and feel completely stifled by the heat, as Julia throughout this time was making strange noises, growling, cursing. So throughout this exorcism, they were getting hotter and hotter and hotter to a point where it was almost unbearable. And she was making these animal-like noises that would have been extremely hard to replicate, and she would speak in foreign languages like Latin and Spanish, despite confirming that she only knew English. Now, of course, the voices would sling insults, as they usually do, to those in the room and against God and all things religious, calling everyone whores and threatening them, saying they would be sorry for this. And it always seems to happen like that, too. It's like, why you gotta call everyone whores all the time? It's like that's their favorite thing, like their favorite thing to say. So all that was going on. And it was during this time that Julia first exhibited a really insane amount of strength, with her resisting 5 grown adults holding her down. They were all struggling to restrain her. And if all that wasn't crazy enough, she was said to have levitated in the air about half a foot, staying there for about 30 minutes. And like I mentioned before, Julia would be fearful of anything sacred, and she was able to tell the difference between holy water and plain water, reacting only to the holy water and not to the plain water, which had been very strategically placed in containers that would make it impossible for her to tell which one was which. Now, although the exorcism was helpful to an extent, Julia began to have reservations about continuing to perform them, and didn't give her permission to continue having them done, where sometimes, you require a part 1, a part 2 to really free someone of these demons. But it's important that this person gives permission, as in they demonstrate the desire to want to be rid of these demons. So Julia, unfortunately, was never really cured or freed of the demon that possessed her. And it is thought that this may be due to her Satanist background and the fact that she may have continued with this lifestyle despite knowing how it was affecting her, which, to be honest, at that point, that's your problem now, Julia. I feel like it's sort of a slap in the face to ask for help, have all these people working hard to help you, trying their best to help you, while you and your demon spew obscenities at them all day long, and then decide, perhaps not. So we don't know where Julia is at this point. I rebuke Julia in the name of Jesus. She's maybe off still doing her Satanist stuff, and she still is probably possessed. But that's what happens when you decide that you don't want to be cured and you don't want to be freed. So that's Julia's story. But an interesting one, again, because it was actually written by a board-certified psychiatrist, and you don't see that as much, where there's a coming together of the medical, psychiatric, world and this kind of religious world. So I thought that one was a cool one to share. But the next story I'm going to give a little bit of a trigger warning for, because there is going to be a short but still a mention of animal abuse and a pretty gory description of what had happened. So if you're squeamish, or if that would trigger you in any way, feel free to end it here. But otherwise, we'll move on to the next story, which is about Michael Taylor, the Ossett murder case. And it's similar to some extent to the famous Devil Made Me Do It case, the case of Arnie Johnson, for all my true crime enthusiasts out there. So Michael was born in 1944 in Ossett, West Yorkshire, and he was 31 at the time. He worked as a butcher. He had a wife named Christine, who was 29, and he had 5 children, all boys. They owned a home in a normal suburban neighborhood, though this area, along with the rest of the country, were beginning to kind of struggle, feeling the effects of the recession that hit around the 70s. So, job markets were kind of running low. People were living a little bit more modestly, but everyone was making an honest living, and Michael was no different. All of his neighbors would go on to say that Michael was very mild-mannered. He was polite. He seemed like just, again, your average guy, a hardworking husband and dad, just trying to provide for his family and live his life in peace. Now, at some point in time, Michael had suffered a back injury, which caused him to begin having difficulty maintaining his career. And that kind of threw him into a sort of depression where he felt pretty withdrawn and disappointed in his quality of life and his limitations. He felt that he was no longer the caregiver that he needed to be for his family. And, this is common with depression. It also led him to be a little bit more withdrawn from his family. Now, when his wife, Christine, brought this up to a family friend, she mentioned that his despair and his lack of ability to cope was due to his lack of spirituality. And even though the family had never been religious prior to this, they decided to attend a meeting of and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but the Gauber Christian Fellowship Group. They were a bit nervous about this at first, not knowing what to expect from all this. But what they found was a group of people who were just typical people moving through life, none fitting the stereotypes of very self-righteous religious people that Michael and Christine had maybe envisioned. So they fit right into the group. They felt welcome and thought that this could be the beginning of something really good for their family. Now, after hearing the preacher, who was a 22-year-old named Marie Robinson, she gave her sermon, and this was icing on the cake. They decided at this point to convert to Christianity and make the decision to become part of this group. So, at this point, they were still very new to Christianity in general, and more so to the group who had kind of deemed themselves part of a new movement called charismatic Christianity, which, by the way, red flags all over. I'm a Christian, but this is red flag central cult territory. If I'm ever in a place that asks me to come to a meeting and then join the group, cult. 100% cult. No, thank you. No, thank you. I'm going to see myself out. No, thank you. Because it's only a matter of time before the leader starts to say they can shoot laser beams out of their eyes or that they have to sleep with all the women in the room because that's the way that it was intended to be. AKA Jonestown, looking at you. Anyway, on this quest to learn more about the group, they decided to join without, first learning more about the group, right? Like they said, all right, I'm going to join, then I'm going to go learn more about it. But I've already joined. So they decided to kind of move backwards on this, but they ended up attending another meeting where Marie would be preaching in a nearby town. During this meeting, Marie began to act really distressed and began to shake while she started to say that she was becoming possessed by the Holy Spirit. Now, not long after, she began speaking in tongues, which is also referred to as glossolalia, which was apparently common for her and for the other group members. So you can imagine Michael and Christine witnessing this. This is their first intro to, Christianity, this kind of cult-like atmosphere where everyone is shaking and speaking in tongues. So Michael actually began to become very enamored by Marie and her way of preaching. She was very soft-spoken, and obviously she was 22 years old. But he became very enamored with her, and he began to attend more and more meetings and more of her teachings in an effort to spend time with her. He even began to request private prayer meetings with her, where it was said that they would sometimes just sit in front of each other, making the sign of the cross over and over in an effort to nullify evil powers, is what was said. Now, eventually, Christine obviously began to grow more and more suspicious of this relationship and of Michael's behaviors. He would lash out at home and make excuses to leave. He would lash out at his children. She kind of, got the vibes whenever Michael was around Marie and started seeing the way that he was looking at her and the way that he wanted to spend more and more time with her. So she was highly suspicious at this point. And so one day during one of these meetings that Michael attended, he began to speak in what maybe he thought was tongues, but it was actually just a series of garbled words that he was screaming while he was violently shaking. The group members were actually really creeped out by this, which is super ironic, because imagine that. They're nonstop shaking, like speaking in tongues at all these meetings, and then he does it, and they're like, ooh, like creepy. But here we are. I guess to them, there was something negative and eerie about it. It didn't sound or look like the typical So they were super concerned. And so Marie was concerned. And so she decided to pay Michael a private visit to check up on him. And this is when Christine finally confronted them and suggested that they be left alone to discuss their feelings for one another. Now, immediately upon Christine leaving the room, Michael tries to kiss Marie, who pleaded with him to think of his wife and his family. So, good for you, Marie, because Marie wasn't into this. Like, Marie wasn't trying for this to be the case. This was a Michael thing. So she didn't reciprocate this. She tried to, persuade him to think about his wife, think about his family. Let's not do this. And when Christine returned to the room, Michael supposedly stood up and said, "We have both overcome our passions." So suddenly, a few minutes later, Michael found himself in this sort of hallucination where he was naked in a place that did not resemble any form of this world. And when he turned to look at Marie, she too was naked, but had the eyes of a snake. And this set Michael off, and he began to verbally and physically assault Marie. So Christine tried to get into the middle of the two of them, but he pushed her out of the way. He even went so far as to grab Marie by the hair and throw her across the room. And so during the trial, Marie reported the following: "I suddenly glanced at Mike and his whole features changed. He looked almost bestial. He kept looking at me and there was a really wild look in his eyes. I started screaming at him out of fear. I started speaking in tongues. Mike also screamed at me in tongues. I was on the verge of death and I seemed to come to my senses. I knew that only the name of Jesus would save me, and I started saying over and over again, 'Jesus.' When Christine heard me calling on the name of Jesus, she started saying it too, and I believe firmly that it was only by calling on his name that I was not killed." Now, Michael eventually snapped out of this state and fell to the floor feeling exhausted, but without any recollection of what had just happened. So Christine was freaked out, pissed off, you name it. She told Marie to leave, that they wanted no part of the group any longer. But Michael's behavior continued to worsen. Neighbors would start to see him in the streets acting super erratically, and he continued to get more and more withdrawn, to lash out, to become more and more violent with his family. And so eventually this behavior started to escalate to a point that sent Christine running back to the church for help again, saying, "Hey, something's wrong, and I don't know where else to turn at this point." So the church leaders, or the group leaders, began to seriously worry about his behavior as well, and determined that he was possessed and that he would need an exorcism. They even went so far as to say that they believed he was possessed by 40 different demons. I have no idea where this information came from or how they determined that it was 40 different demons, but it seems like from their reports, the way that they kind of described the demons was there was the demon of infidelity and the demon of, vulgarity, and there were kind of different demons. There were kind of different demons for different negative subjects, I guess you could say, and that he was possessed by all of them. So I think that's a little bit different typically than the normal possession of demon, like how it would typically be described. But I guess this was kind of the standard of how this particular group saw it. So around midnight on October 5th of 1974, Christine and Michael met with a man named Father Peter Vincent and another named Reverend Raymond Smith. And there were a few other members of the church group there as well. And for the next 8 hours, witnesses in court would say that an exorcism was performed while Michael, who was thrashing about, convulsing, spitting, spewing obscenities, had to be tied down to the floor because of this intense strength. They stated that Michael was doused in holy water and specifically reported that he had a crucifix jammed in his throat throughout this process, which I'm not 100% sure if they mean like literally or figuratively, but anyways, as everyone, as this whole process was going on, it became exhausting. And so everyone grew extremely tired. And so they decided to stop the exorcism, go home for some rest, reconvene in the morning when they would initiate part 2. The prayer group felt that they were able to rid Michael of some of the demons, but not others, with the others being those that were more violent and thus more powerful. And thus that's why it required a part 2. Then shortly after 9:45 a.m. on the morning of October 6th, police were called about a man walking around town in a frenzy, naked and covered from head to toe in paint. When police made their way to the town, it was not long before they found Michael's. This was a small town, and it was earlier in the morning. And so they, pulled him in the car and offered to take him home. And returning home, they found an extremely gruesome scene. And so, again, trigger warning here with our description of what had happened. Now, Michael had attacked his wife, brutally attacked her, shortly after they returned home. Police reports say that he tore her eyes and tongue clean out with his bare hands and ripped the skin from her skull, leaving blood everywhere. The floors, the ceiling, the walls, the furniture, it was everywhere. He even, in his frenzy, attacked the family dog, dismembering it, again with his bare hands, and throwing its severed limbs in various places, including across the street outside the home. Now, all I can think about at this point was, thank God the kids were not home, that they were spending the night at their grandparents' house because the parents had sent them away so that they could go and do the exorcism. So you can only imagine, where would he have stopped if he was in such a frenzy and in this such a state that he not only brutally attacked his wife, but also just the family dog for being there, what he would have done to his kids. Now, a police officer on the scene reportedly said, quote, "You don't want to see this one, son. I've seen nothing like it before, and I've seen a few. It's the wife. He's ripped at her, son. It's a right mess in there. There's not much left of her. You don't want to see it," end quote, before he himself vomited. Now, at this time, Michael had been at the hospital receiving medical treatment, but obviously the police went to arrest him once he was cleared, and when asking what his motive was, he never gave any more information other than, "Released. I am released. It is done. The evil in her has been destroyed." He also claimed that the exorcism attempted the previous night was not successful, and that the devil was actually within Christine. And that when they performed the exorcism, they ended up sending him home with the devil, who was now Christine. Michael Taylor would then stand trial for killing his wife, and on March 25th in Leeds Crown Court, Michael was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The coroner felt sure that Michael truly believes that he was ridding her of evil spirits and that he was a very, very mentally ill man. Which, side note, this is not an excuse, in my opinion. That's kind of like a BS ruling. No shit. He's a very mentally ill man. Nobody who is not very mentally ill would do that, but you still have to be held accountable. Unfortunately, he may not have had the care that he needed if it was truly mental illness and not possession, but at this point you've committed the crime, you still need to be held accountable. That's just my take on it. Now, after sentencing, a psychiatrist named Dr. Hugo Milne was asked to perform an evaluation on Michael, and he also found him to be extremely detached from reality and completely unaware of his surroundings. He did not think it fit for Michael to be kept in prison, so Michael was instead sent to a psychiatric hospital where he underwent treatment for 4 years. So he was released 4 years later, and after this, Michael tried to commit suicide 4 times and was unsuccessful every single time. And then at one point, Michael was arrested again for attempted assault on an underage girl. And then not long after being placed in prison for this, he began to show, again, erratic behavior, prompting another evaluation and sentencing to a psychiatric hospital for, again, treatment, even though it clearly did not work the first time when he was in there for 4 years receiving treatment. So What do you guys think? The medical side of things said that Michael was insane. However, the Reverend and the church group truly believed he exhibited signs of possession, although the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time condemned the actions of the church group and felt them to be very, very irresponsible. And I have to say, given the fact, like we mentioned, in the story above, there's a vigorous testing process to determine possession versus mentally ill, and they did not do their due diligence at all to make sure that what they were dealing with was truly possession. They just decided on a whim to carry out this exorcism on someone who was already suffering mentally with bouts of depression, and someone who was, clearly becoming more and more withdrawn. And it could certainly have been that he was truly possessed, but we will never know for sure given the lack of evidence gathered prior to performing the exorcism, like a psychiatric eval. But again, I still stand by the fact that even though that could be the case, the crime was still committed. It was a horrific crime, and justice should be served for that crime. Now, at the end, what Michael did, it was just tragic for Christine and for her children. And so I hope that these kids were able to get some help to process all that had gone on, because I can't even imagine what they emotionally will have been left to deal with. And that concludes our episode today on Everyday Eerie. Be sure to check out my Instagram page, and don't forget to send a personal ghost story to everydayeerie26@gmail.com. I would love to read them. And thank you for joining me on this journey into the eerie and unexplained. I hope these stories captivated your imagination, and that you will join me next time for more tales of the strange and the supernatural. Until then, keep an eye out for the eerie in your everyday.